The black Maybach glided to a stop before the marble steps, and the entire lobby of the Callaway Tower seemed to stop breathing, not because of the car but because of the man who stepped out of it. Royce Callaway never needed to raise his voice to make people part before him. He only needed to appear, the unhurried stride of a man who had never once had to rush for anything in his life, leather shoes striking the stone floor dry and sharp like the ticking of a countdown, and a single glance across the crowd, enough to make even the most powerful figures in Chicago lower their eyes to the tips of their own shoes. Delaney Ward never heard him coming. She was kneeling in the middle of the lobby, wiping up a coffee stain someone had spilled on the stone, her hair tucked hastily beneath a janitor's cap, her cart loaded with rags and spray bottles blocking one corner of the walkway. 5:40 in the morning, the hour when the whole city still slept, when only people like her were awake to erase yesterday's traces before people like him walked in and soiled today. "Move that thing out of my way." The voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was the kind of voice so used to being obeyed that it had forgotten such a thing as refusal even existed. Delaney didn't look up right away. She set down the cloth, drew in a breath, and silently counted to 3, an old habit, from back when she still sat in rooms where a single wrong number could bury a person alive. Only then did she raise her eyes. He stood there, tall, the coat on his back worth more than a year of her wages, looking at her as if she were just one more stain someone needed to wipe away. Behind him came a few quiet laughs. One person, then another. The kind of laughter that springs not from joy but from fear of standing on the wrong side. So they laughed along with the man certain to win. She didn't argue a word. She rose, pulled the cart tight against the wall, its wheels shrieking a long line across the stone. The sound dragged on longer than it should have, and for that moment, the entire lobby could hear nothing else. "That's better," Royce said, already stepping past her without bothering to glance back. "Someone who knows her place." He vanished behind the elevator doors. The crowd dispersed. No one noticed the janitor still standing by the wall, both hands resting on the cart's handle, her back strangely straight as the spine of someone long accustomed to standing before men 100 times more powerful than the one who had just passed, and never once bowing her head. What neither Royce Callaway nor the woman scrubbing the floor below yet knew was this. Before the week was out, the most powerful man in Chicago would stand before the woman he had just treated like garbage and beg her to save the one thing on earth his money could not buy. And she would be forced to choose, to reach out and save the man who had crushed her, or to turn her back and walk away. And the name Delaney Ward hid beneath that janitor's cap. If the crowd that had just laughed at her ever learned it, not one of them would dare laugh again. If this story already has you holding your breath, then buckle up, because what comes next will steal it away entirely. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, so you never miss a single moving story to come. The 40th floor of Callaway Tower had no noise. People said the only sound permitted to exist there was the breathing of those waiting for Royce Callaway to speak. That morning, inside the walnut-paneled conference room, looking straight out over the cold gray surface of Lake Michigan, 6 men in suits sat around the long table, and one man stood at the head of it, both hands braced against the glass, his back turned to them as he looked down at the city waking below. No one dared to clear his throat. The man sitting closest to the door, a plump fellow with a gold watch hanging heavy on his wrist, kept wiping sweat from his forehead, even though the air conditioning was cold enough to make a person shiver. He had just won a construction bid worth many millions of dollars by forcing a string of small contractors to drop their prices until they went bankrupt, then swallowing their work without paying them a single cent. He thought Royce had invited him up here to congratulate him. He was wrong. Royce turned around. He didn't sit down. He simply placed a thin stack of documents on the table and pushed it lightly toward the fat man with 2 fingers, slowly, the way someone might push a final chess piece into place. The fat man looked down. His face went pale. Inside that stack of papers were the names of 11 small contractors, the contracts torn apart halfway through, the forged signatures, and the money that should have been paid to workers who were now sitting at home with no jobs. There was even a photograph of a machine shop that had shut down, its sign hanging crookedly upside down in front of the gate. Royce said nothing about any of it. He only poured himself a glass of water, took one sip, then set the glass down so softly it made no sound. "I'm giving you 3 days," he said, his voice so quiet the fat man had to lean forward to hear him. 3 days to pay back every dollar to every person on this list, plus the interest you forced them to carry. The fat man gave a strained laugh and started to open his mouth to argue. Royce lifted one hand a little, only a little, and the man fell silent as if someone had seized his throat. Royce came closer, pulled out the empty chair beside him, sat down, folded his arms on the table, and looked straight into his eyes with a calmness more frightening than any rage could have been. "Do you know why I don't like men like you?" he asked. "It isn't because you're greedy. Everyone in this room is greedy. It's because you choose people who can't fight back. You hunt the weak because the weak stay silent. That is the most cowardly thing a man can do." The fat man trembled as he said it was only business, that everyone did the same thing, that Royce had no right. Royce smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "I have no right," he repeated, "but I have these papers, and I have relationships with every bank that has ever lent you money. By noon tomorrow, if this list hasn't been paid, there won't be a bank in this city that will take your call. By the end of the week, your name won't appear in any bidding file within 500 miles. And by next month, you'll understand what it feels like to be one of the workers you threw into the street." The room was so silent that the ticking of the clock on the wall could be heard. None of the 5 remaining men dared to look toward the fat man, as if even looking at him would be enough to make them guilty by association. Royce stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and stepped back toward the window, as though nothing had happened at all. 3 days, he said one last time without turning his head. "Don't make me remind you." The fat man hurriedly gathered the documents in hands that shook uncontrollably, then almost ran out of the room. When the door closed behind him, one of the men still seated there, Royce's longtime advisor, breathed out softly, and said he could have crushed him immediately, instead of giving him a chance. Royce looked down at the city, where small, ordinary people were hurrying to work, people who would never set foot on this 40th floor in their entire lives. "I don't crush people because I enjoy crushing them," he answered quietly. "I do it so the powerful men in this city remember there is still a line." He paused for a moment, his gaze distant. "Whoever crosses it, I'll make sure they learn the price." The advisor said nothing more. He had worked for Royce Calloway long enough to understand that this man could be chillingly ruthless with those who deserved it. But not once, not even once, had he ever seen him strike someone who couldn't defend themselves. That was the one rule Royce never broke. The rule that even the enemies who hated him most had to acknowledge. What neither the advisor nor Royce himself knew was that only a few hours earlier, right at the foot of this very tower, he had broken that very rule with a woman kneeling on the stone floor, and that small mistake would come back to find him far sooner than he imagined. At 11 o'clock at night, Delaney Ward climbed 3 flights of stairs because the elevator in the building had been broken since before she moved in. The hallway was dim beneath a sickly yellow bulb that flickered to its own uneven rhythm, and she had grown so used to it that she no longer noticed. She unlocked the door as quietly as she could, set her bag down, slipped off the shoes with the worn-down heels, and stepped inside barefoot so she wouldn't make a sound. In the corner of the room, beneath the soft glow of a star-shaped nightlight, her daughter was sleeping deeply. Posy was only 6 years old, one arm wrapped around a frayed, stuffed rabbit, her round cheeks flushed pink, her breathing steady and peaceful, as if the whole world beyond that door didn't exist at all. Delaney went to the bed, pulled the thin blanket up over her daughter's shoulders, then stood there for a long while just looking at her. This was the reason. This had always been the reason. Every night, after scrubbing away other people's dirt, after hearing words like the ones that man in the lobby had spoken that morning, she could still come home and see this face, and everything became worth it again. She sat down in the old chair by the window, looked out at the glittering lights of Chicago in the distance, and for a moment, memory drew her back to the time when her name had once been spoken with a different title attached to it. 3 years earlier, Delaney Ward had been a sought-after forensic accountant at one of the largest investment funds in the city. She was the person they called when the numbers refused to line up, when something had been hidden behind long rows of details no one else could see. She was so good that people said she could hear a lie whispering among thousands of transactions. Then came the day they placed an audit report in front of her and told her to sign it. That report concealed a massive sum of money that had vanished from client accounts, and that money had flowed straight into the pocket of the chief executive officer's son. They told her that all it would take was one signature, and everything would be smoothed over. Her career would rise. She would have a corner office with glass windows looking out over the lake. She refused. She wrote into the file exactly what she had found, not removing a single word, not softening it to make it easier to hear. 1 week later, the resignation letter on her desk already had her name typed at the bottom. The meeting with the board was only a formality. They called it a procedural error, as if 3 years of spotless work could be erased with one phrase. But they didn't stop there. Before she could find another job, her name had already been whispered throughout the industry, painted as someone dishonest, someone untrustworthy, and her professional license was suspended, pending an investigation everyone knew would drag on forever. Not a single financial company dared to hire her. The doors she had once knocked on with confidence now closed in her face, politely but firmly. Her savings dwindled while rent and milk for Posey waited for no one. Then, one afternoon, while standing in line with dozens of other people outside an employment agency, she realized that the only job anyone was willing to give her immediately, the only job that didn't require the resume that had been stained black, was cleaning. She took it without hesitation, because a 6-year-old child couldn't understand the word honor. But she understood very clearly what it meant to have a warm dinner in her stomach. Delaney looked away from the window. The past had been left behind, and she didn't allow herself to sit with it for long. She stood, walked to the old cabinet against the wall, opened the bottom drawer, and took out a small box. Inside were an old laptop and a notebook with curled edges, the only things left from the person she used to be. Every night, after Posey fell asleep, she still opened that notebook, still followed the numbers through her mind, because some skills never leave a person, even after the whole world has turned its back. She glanced at her daughter one more time, smiled very softly, then opened the notebook beneath the lamplight. Outside, the city still didn't know that the woman who mopped the floors inside its tallest tower had once been the best in the business at reading the lies hidden behind numbers, and that before long, that very buried skill would pull her back to the exact place where she had fallen. Morning at the boarding house always began with the heavy thudding of children running down the hallway and the smell of cheap coffee drifting out from the shared kitchens. Delaney had just come home from the night shift, her eyes still burning from lack of sleep, when she found Carmen crouched on the bottom stair, both hands clutching her head, a stack of crumpled papers scattered around her feet. Carmen was the mother who lived in the last unit down the hall, raising 2 children on the wages of a kitchen helper. A woman who always smiled even though she had very few reasons to smile, and that morning was the first time Delaney had ever seen her cry. They had borrowed a small amount from a fast loan company the previous winter, when the youngest child had to be hospitalized, and now the number they owed had swollen to many times the original amount, so large that Carmen couldn't understand how it had become that way. She had taken the papers to a free legal advisor at the community center, and they had told her the contract was legal, the signature was hers, and there was nothing to be done. Delaney sat down beside her, quietly picked up the papers, and smoothed each sheet across her knees. "May I take a look?" she said gently, and Carmen handed them over without much hope, only the way someone pours out her troubles to a kind neighbor. But Delaney didn't read those papers like a neighbor. She read them the way her entire life had trained her to read, line by line, every tiny printed note along the edge of the page, every number pushed down to the bottom of a table, where people's eyes usually slipped past. And there, among the dense terms written for the very purpose of making sure no one would bother reading them to the end, she found it. A compound interest penalty clause calculated by the week instead of by the month, as the company had verbally told Carmen, a number hidden behind a comma placed in the wrong spot, and most importantly, a line stating that the applied interest rate had exceeded the limit allowed by state law. The free lawyer had skimmed over it and missed it because he had looked at the signature without looking at the numbers. Delaney did the opposite. "You don't owe as much as they say," she told Carmen, her voice calm but firm. "Most of this money is illegal, and I can show you exactly where." While Carmen stared at her with a look caught between astonishment and disbelief, Delaney took a pen and circled each line, wrote notes in the margins in neat, decisive handwriting, and drafted a letter for her demanding that the company explain the fees by their proper legal names. She did it so quickly that Carmen had to ask who she was, and how a cleaning woman knew such things. Delaney only smiled and didn't answer directly. "My father once said something to me when I was little," she said softly, her hand still moving across the page. "He told me numbers never know how to lie. Only people lie with them. My job is just to find out who is lying." Carmen didn't fully understand that sentence, but she held the letter as if she were holding an escape ticket. 3 days later, the lending company withdrew almost all of the penalties, rather than allow the matter to be brought into the light, and Carmen's debt shrank to only a small portion of what it had been. The news spread very quietly through the boarding house, the way kind things often spread, from one person's mouth to another person's ear. And Carmen, in a gratitude she didn't know how to express, told the story to her cousin, a quiet man who worked as a driver for an office downtown. An office that belonged to the vast network of people working under Royce Calloway. He listened to the story about the cleaning woman who could read the traps hidden inside contracts even lawyers had given up on. And he remembered it, storing it in a corner of his mind, the way people keep something that seems useless, but might one day be needed. Delaney knew nothing about that. She only went back to her room, lay down to snatch a few hours of sleep before her next shift, her heart lighter because she had helped someone. She couldn't have imagined that this small good deed, planted on an exhausted morning, would become the fragile thread that led the most powerful man in Chicago straight to her door, at the exact moment when he had nowhere else left to hold on. 3 days after that morning in the 40th floor conference room, an express delivery envelope was placed on Royce Calloway's desk, and when he opened it, for the first time in many years, he felt something that money should have erased from his life long ago. Inside was a notice from the prosecutor's office, along with a stack of bank statements, and the name printed in bold on them wasn't his, but the name of his 16-year-old younger brother, Eli. According to what the papers showed, a large sum of money had been transferred through a trust account under the boy's name, routed through several shell companies, then vanished into destinations no one could trace, and every paper trail pointed in one single direction, that Eli himself was the one behind the siphoning of that money. Royce knew his brother. He had raised him since the boy was far too young to understand, had become his support in place of their dead parents, and he knew as surely as he knew the rhythm of his own heartbeat that the boy had never signed anything like that. But papers didn't care what he knew. Papers only presented numbers, and those numbers had been arranged so intricately that they looked like a written confession. This wasn't an accident. This was a trap, laid by an enemy patient enough and intelligent enough to understand that the way to wound Royce Calloway wasn't to aim at him, but to aim at the only weakness he had in the world. Royce called in the most expensive team of lawyers in the city, people he paid handsomely so he would never have to hear the words "can't be done." They arrived in tailored suits, spread the files across the conference table, and worked for 2 days and 2 nights. Then, one by one, they looked up with the same expression, the kind of expression Royce had never seen on their faces before. They said the paperwork was too airtight. Every signature matched, every timestamp was seamless, every path of the money had been constructed so perfectly that there wasn't a single crack to slip through. Whoever had created it had left no mistake behind, or if there was one, it was hidden somewhere that not one legal mind in that room could see. One of them, the best among them, told Royce directly what the others didn't dare say, that if they couldn't find the breaking point in this chain of numbers within the next few days, the boy would have to appear in court, and with evidence like that on paper, no amount of money would be large enough to change the outcome. For the first time in his life, Royce Calloway sat in the most powerful room he owned and realized that everything he had, all his money, all his connections, all the fear his name had sown throughout the city, had become useless before a trap woven purely from numbers. He could make a grown man tremble with one quiet sentence, but he couldn't read the lie lying motionless among thousands of lines of transactions, and that helplessness ate at him from the inside in a way no enemy had ever managed to do. That night, after the legal team had gone, and the room held only Royce and the quiet driver still waiting in the corner, Royce asked, almost as if speaking to himself, whether there truly wasn't a single person left in this entire city who could see what the finest minds had missed. The driver was silent for a while, then spoke carefully. He said he had once heard a story, perhaps only a rumor, about a woman who knew how to read the traps hidden inside contracts that even lawyers had given up on, a woman who had untangled a debt that seemed impossible to untangle for his cousin. He added, a little hesitantly, that the woman was currently working as a cleaner. Royce looked up. In his mind, a faint image from the morning a few days earlier suddenly flashed and disappeared. The image of a woman kneeling on the stone floor. A woman whose face he hadn't even bothered to look at properly. He hadn't yet connected the two things. He only knew that now, when every door of power had closed, he was willing to cling even to a vague rumor about a woman who mopped floors, without knowing that fate was arranging for him to bow his head before the very person he had treated like trash. The basement garage of Calloway Tower at nearly 6 o'clock in the morning was a cold and empty place, with only the steady hum of the ventilation system and the pale white fluorescent lights spilling down over rows of concrete pillars. Delaney had just finished her shift, her thin coat draped over one arm, and was walking toward the bus stop when she realized there was a man waiting beside a sleek black car, with no driver, no bodyguards, only himself. She recognized him at once, and she saw that he had recognized her too, saw the moment his eyes stopped when he connected the face before him now with the image of the woman kneeling on the stone floor, the woman he had spoken to with contempt only a few days earlier. A brief silence passed between them, heavy and awkward, the silence of a man accustomed to giving orders but this time not knowing where to begin. "I need to speak with you," Royce finally said, his voice deliberately lowered, though it still carried the tone of someone who had never had to beg anyone for anything. Delaney didn't stop walking. She went around him, headed straight for the exit, and answered with one short sentence, saying she had nothing to say to him. He followed her, saying he knew who she was, knew about what she had once done, that she had an ability no one else in this city had. She gave a soft laugh, a laugh with no joy in it at all, and said that a few days ago he hadn't needed to know who she was, because back then, to him, she had only been something blocking the way that needed to be moved aside. Those words silenced Royce completely, and inside that silence was something close to shame, a feeling so foreign to him that even he couldn't name it. She kept walking, her back straight, not looking back, and everything would have ended there if he hadn't said the next 3 words in a voice that had dropped all its authority. "It's my brother." Delaney slowed. He went on, more urgently now, saying the boy was only 16 years old, that someone had built a set of documents to pin on him a crime he hadn't committed, that the best lawyers he had hired had all reached a dead end, and that if no one could find the truth hidden inside those numbers, the boy would have to go to court with a sentence already almost decided for him. She stopped completely. She didn't turn around right away. She stood there in the cold garage, listening to the tone in his voice, and she recognized it, not because she had ever heard Royce Calloway speak that way before, but because she had heard that very tone in people standing on the edge of losing the most precious thing in their lives. It was the voice of someone who had knocked on every door, and this was the last door left. That voice couldn't be faked. A person either had it in a moment of true desperation, or they didn't. And she, a mother, thought immediately of a 16-year-old child being accused of a terrible crime he hadn't committed. Slowly, she turned back and looked straight into his eyes. And what she saw there was no longer the arrogant man from the lobby, but only an older brother terrified for his younger brother. "I'm not doing this for you," she said, her voice cold and clear with every word. "Do you understand? I haven't forgotten what you said to me, and one cry for help doesn't erase it." Royce nodded. He didn't argue, didn't defend himself, only accepted it in silence. "I agree to look over the papers," she continued, "because of that boy, because no child deserves to carry someone else's crime. If he's truly innocent, I'll find it. If he's guilty, I'll be the first person to tell you. And when that happens, don't expect me to help you cover up anything." Royce looked at the woman standing before him, the woman he had treated only a few days earlier as if she didn't exist, and for the first time, he understood that there were people who couldn't be bought with money and couldn't be bent by power, people who only lowered themselves to help because their conscience told them to do so. He quietly said thank you, 2 words he perhaps hadn't spoken to anyone with such honesty in a very long time. Delaney didn't answer his thanks. She only told him to bring every paper to her, complete, without a single page missing, and then she would tell him whether the truth could still save him or not. And when she walked out of the garage, leaving the most powerful man in Chicago standing alone among the rows of concrete pillars, she had no idea that her decision to help a strange child was opening a door, leading straight back to the past she had buried, and toward a truth far larger than anything she could imagine. That afternoon, Delaney stepped into the conference room on the 40th floor, still wearing her simple everyday clothes, and her arrival made the whole room fall silent, in a way very different from the kind of silence Royce was used to creating. 5 lawyers in expensive suits looked up at her with unconcealed skepticism, their eyes moving from her shoes with the worn-down heels to her hastily tied hair. And in those eyes was the question no one said aloud. What could this cleaning woman possibly do when all of them had already failed? Royce stood at the head of the table. He offered no explanation, only gestured for her to sit before the towering stack of files and the thick bundles of printed bank statements spread across the entire tabletop. Delaney didn't sit down right away. She took off her coat, draped it over the back of the chair, pulled the chair closer, and began. She asked no questions, needed no summary from anyone, and didn't touch the cup of coffee someone had placed in front of her. She simply drew the first stack of papers toward herself and began to read, and the way she read made the lawyers gradually stop speaking among themselves and turn to look at her. Her finger moved steadily and calmly down the columns of numbers, without haste, her eyes following a private rhythm that only someone in the profession would understand. The rhythm of a person who wasn't reading each number, but reading the spaces between them, reading the things that should have been there but were missing. 1 hour passed, then nearly 2, and the room sank into the soft rustle of turning pages. One of the lawyers began to grow impatient and was about to say that they had already reviewed all of this, but Royce only lifted his hand slightly, and the man fell silent. Delaney turned to the bank statements from the final months, skimmed through thousands of transaction lines, strung together like an endless river of data, and then her finger slowed. She flipped back a few pages, then forward again, her eyes stopping at one point, and she reached for the red pen beside her and circled one line. She kept turning the pages, circling another line, then another, on pages dozens of sheets apart. When she set the pen down, there were 6 red circles scattered throughout the entire file, and she turned the stack around so everyone could see. "There is one money transfer that repeats again and again," she said, her voice so composed that it sounded even clearer in the silent room. "Every few weeks, always at 3 o'clock in the morning, and always in a strange, uneven amount, never a round number." She tapped the tip of the pen against one of the red circles. "No one transfers money at 3 o'clock in the morning. A 16-year-old boy certainly doesn't. This isn't a transaction made by a human being sitting in front of a computer. This is an automated order scheduled by software, and whoever programmed it was too confident, so he left behind one habit, this odd number. It repeats exactly every time, off at the same decimal place, like a signature he didn't even know he was leaving. Find out who controls this automated order, and you'll find the person who truly siphoned off that money, and it isn't the boy." The room went utterly still. Not one lawyer spoke, because all of them had just realized that they had held these pages in their hands for 2 days, had read them again and again, yet not one of them had stopped long enough to see what this woman had seen in less than 2 hours. The best lawyer, the one who had once told Royce directly that they had reached a dead end, silently pulled the file toward himself, looked at the red circles, and gave a small nod, a nod that admitted defeat and offered recognition at the same time. Royce wasn't looking at the papers. He was looking at her. He looked at the woman he had treated only days ago, as if she were a stain beneath his feet, the woman who had done in one afternoon what an entire team he paid millions of dollars couldn't do, and for the first time in his life, the look he gave another human being wasn't a calculation of how much they were worth or how dangerous they might be, but something he rarely felt toward anyone, pure respect. Delaney didn't notice that look, or she deliberately pretended not to. She only stood, put her coat back on, and said her part was done here, and now it was the job of the people being paid to follow the lead she had just pointed out. But when she walked out the door, Royce remained standing there, watching her leave, and inside him, a question began to kindle, the question of why someone this gifted had to mop other people's floors at dawn, and he didn't yet know that the answer would lead him to a secret, buried deep inside his own family. Mrs. Marlowe Hartley lived on the top floor of the boarding house, in a small room whose window looked out over a whole corner of the city, and from the day Delaney moved in, she was the only person in the building Delaney truly thought of as family. Every afternoon, when Delaney went to work, Posey often went over to sit with her, and that afternoon, when Delaney stopped by to pick up her daughter before her shift, she found the two of them leaning close together over the old wooden table, while the little girl was absorbed in coloring on a blank sheet of paper. Posey looked up the moment she saw her mother, her eyes shining, proudly announcing that she had just drawn a picture for Mrs. Marlowe, and she lifted the sheet with all the pride of a 6-year-old child. In the drawing, 3 people stood holding hands in front of a towering building that reached up to pink clouds, 1 grown-up, 1 old woman with silver hair, and 1 tiny little girl in the middle, all of them wearing oversized smiles drawn with a red crayon. Mrs. Marlowe held the picture in her wrinkled hands and looked at it for a long time, and then something rare happened. The corners of her mouth softened, her shoulders trembled faintly, and she laughed. A strangely bright, clear laugh, coming from someone far too old to laugh easily. She said it had been a very long time since anyone had drawn anything for her, and that she would tape it to the window so she could see it every morning when she woke up. Posey clapped her hands with a delighted giggle, And in that moment, the little room felt warm, as if there weren't a cold city waiting outside at all. Delaney made her a cup of tea, and when Posey ran to the corner of the room to play with her crayons, Mrs. Marlowe suddenly looked at Delaney with a different gaze, deeper and more distant. She asked where Delaney worked, and when she heard Delaney mention the name Callaway Tower, the hand lifting the teacup stopped halfway. She set the cup down very gently, stayed silent for a while, then asked Delaney's last name again, even though she already knew it, as if she needed to hear it one more time. Ward, Delaney answered, a little surprised. Mrs. Marlowe nodded slowly, her eyes drifting out the window toward the faraway high-rises. She said that was a name she had heard before, a very long time ago. So long ago that almost the whole city had forgotten. She told Delaney, in a quiet and even voice, that many years earlier, inside the very tower where Delaney now mopped floors every night, there had once been a man with the last name Ward, a rare, decent, and honest man, someone who had done things that made that name respected in the city's financial circles. Then she stopped, and in that silence was an old sorrow no words could fully carry. That man fell, she said, not because he was wrong, but because he was right, at a time when people didn't want anyone to be right. Delaney waited for her to go on. But Mrs. Marlowe only shook her head softly and said it was a story from a time long gone, that perhaps it was only a coincidence of shared surnames, and she smiled it away the way someone brushes off a speck of dust. Delaney didn't understand why that story made her heart sink, or why the name of a stranger left a strange feeling in her chest, like the echo of something she had once known but could no longer remember. She was about to ask more, but it was time for work, and Posey was already running over to wrap her arms around her leg, asking for a hug before Mommy left. Delaney lifted her daughter, kissed her soft hair, thanked Mrs. Marlowe, and stepped out the door. But as she went down the stairs, the old woman's words kept following her. He fell because he was right at a time when people didn't want anyone to be right, and she couldn't know that those seemingly passing words were the first clue to a truth that had been buried for 30 years, a truth carried in her own blood. On Saturday morning, the flea market held in the vacant lot at the end of the street was always crowded and noisy, with vegetable stands, old clothes, and household goods spread everywhere beneath tarps of every color, and Delaney usually stopped by to buy a few cheap things before going home to rest. She was choosing a few apples when she heard the sound of a loud argument coming from the far end of the market, not the usual kind of quarrel between buyer and seller, but the kind of sound that made people stop what they were doing and turn to look. A large man in a leather jacket was standing in front of a small hardware stall, blocking the way and forcing an elderly couple back against a corrugated metal wall. The husband tried to stand in front of his wife, his hands trembling, while the other man waved a stack of papers in their faces, loudly demanding that they immediately pay a sum many times larger than the amount they had borrowed to open this tiny stall, or else he would send people to clear the whole place out that very afternoon. The crowd gathered into a circle, many people whispering among themselves, but no one stepped forward, because the man had the look of someone who made a living by intimidation, and everyone was afraid of inviting trouble onto themselves. Delaney stood among the crowd, and by all rights, she could have been only another witness like everyone else. But when the man raised the papers high to threaten them, her eyes accidentally swept over the printed lines on them, and the reflex that had lived in her blood for so many years immediately woke again. She stepped out of the crowd. "Let me see that contract," she said, her voice not loud, but clear enough to make the whole circle of people fall silent. The man spun around, looked her up and down with contempt, saw a plainly dressed woman carrying a bag of apples, then laughed and asked who she was to think she could interfere. "I'm someone who knows how to read what you're holding in your hand," she answered, and held out her hand. Perhaps because he was surprised, or because he was too confident that no one could do anything to him, he handed her the papers as if issuing a challenge. Delaney skimmed through them quickly, turning each page with practiced fingers, and within moments, her face had changed. "This contract is fake," she said, lifting her eyes to meet his directly. "Not fake in the signature, but fake in the way it was constructed." She turned to the last page and tapped one finger against a number. "The interest rate written here is far beyond the limit allowed by state law, which already makes it illegal in itself." She flipped back a few pages. "And here as well, the date on the signing page doesn't match the disbursement date recorded later. They're months apart, which means most of the so-called interest you're demanding was added for a period when the loan didn't even exist yet." She folded the papers and handed them back to the elderly couple standing frozen in shock instead of giving them to the man. "You two don't owe this person that amount," she told them, her voice softening. "The people who made this paper did it to frighten those who can't afford a lawyer, and it will collapse the moment someone is willing to read it carefully." The man's face turned red. He stammered threats, saying she didn't know who she was getting involved with, but Delaney didn't step back. She looked straight at him and said that if he dared come back here one more time, she would help this couple submit the entire set of papers to the State Consumer Protection Agency, along with a clause-by-clause analysis of every violation she had just pointed out. And when that happened, the people who would have to appear in court wouldn't be them. The way she said those things, concise, precise, without the slightest hesitation, left the man speechless. He looked around at the crowd, which had now turned fully toward her side, hurriedly snatched up the papers, threw out one hollow threat for appearance's sake, then slunk away. After he was gone, the whole market remained silent for a moment, then broke open into murmurs. People looked at Delaney with eyes completely different from before. Some recognized her as the cleaning woman who still came and went through this neighborhood every morning, and the question passed from one mouth to another, asking where a person who worked as a cleaner had learned the kind of knowledge she had just shown. The elderly couple held her hands with tears in their eyes and thanked her, while Delaney only smiled softly, picked up her bag of apples, and quietly left. But she knew that from this moment on, the shell of an anonymous floor cleaner she had worn for all these months could no longer hide her, and the news about that woman would spread throughout the neighborhood faster than she imagined. The news about the woman who had exposed the debt collector in the middle of the flea market reached Royce within a single day. But what caught his attention wasn't what she had done. It was the name behind that man. When he had his people trace the predatory lending ring that was trapping poor families all across that neighborhood, Royce discovered that it wasn't some scattered, self-made crew, but one link in a much larger network. And that network was backed by the very faction he had been quietly opposing for the past several months. The same faction behind the trap set for his younger brother. Suddenly, every piece fell into place. The man leading the operation was a name already known in the shadowed side of business. Someone who specialized in hiding behind carefully written contracts to bleed people who had no strength to defend themselves, and he did it under the protection of people sitting in elegant, spotless rooms, people who never had to dirty their own hands. Royce didn't call his lawyers. He went himself. That night, inside a warehouse converted into an office in the industrial district on the edge of the city, the ringleader was sitting behind a broad desk among his men when the door opened and Royce Calloway walked in, alone, unhurried, his leather shoes striking the cement floor one step at a time, like a count being measured out. The men sprang to their feet, but the ringleader raised one hand to signal them to stay still, trying to hold on to his composure even though his face had already changed color, because even in this underworld, there was no one who didn't know the man who had just walked in. Royce pulled out a chair and sat across from him, as calm as if he were sitting in his own office. He dropped the file onto the table, letting the heavy paper slap against the wood with a cold, deliberate finality that made the ringleader's heart skip a beat. Inside that file were the names of dozens of families his network had driven to the edge. The dirty money washed through false contracts, and in the final pages, the thread leading straight from him to the real masters hiding behind the curtain. "I know you're only hired muscle," Royce said, his voice so quiet the entire warehouse seemed to hold its breath to hear him. "You hunt people who can't fight back because someone pays you to do it. But today, you made one mistake. You touched a neighborhood I'm watching, and you touched a 16-year-old child who has nothing to do with your filthy games." The ringleader tried to give a cold laugh, saying Royce had no evidence that could tie him to anything, that everything on paper was clean. Royce didn't answer right away. He only looked at him for a long time, with a calmness that raised the hair on the back of the neck, the kind of gaze more terrifying than any threat, then said that by tomorrow morning, every bank that had ever laundered money for this network would receive a copy of that file, that by noon, the prosecutor's office would have the other copy, and that the hidden masters he had always thought would protect him would be the first ones to cut him loose in order to save themselves. "When that happens," Royce said, "you'll understand what it feels like to be one of the people you backed into a corner." The ringleader lost the last of his composure. His men rushed forward, ready to strike, and in that brief instant there was a surge of shoving. Several bodies went down, but everything ended so quickly it almost hadn't had time to begin, because Royce's security team, who had been monitoring the perimeter, breached the room in a flash the moment the tension turned physical. Understanding that touching Royce Calloway would only make everything worse for him, the ringleader backed down. When all of it settled, Royce was still sitting in the same chair, not even adjusting the front of his jacket, as if nothing that had just happened was worth his concern. He stood, buttoned his suit, and before turning away, left one final sentence behind, telling the man to pass on a message to the people paying him, that this game was over, and that they had chosen the wrong family to touch. He walked out of the warehouse, leaving behind a ringleader who now understood that his small empire had collapsed in only a few minutes, without Royce needing to raise his voice once. But the most important thing was that as Royce delivered that blow, he knew exactly what he had just done. He had publicly declared war on the powerful faction standing in the shadows, the faction whose leader, though he didn't yet suspect it, was the very woman who was about to become his wife. Tabitha Voss was not the kind of woman who allowed her emotions to show, and that was exactly why she was dangerous. As one of the sharpest lawyers in the city, the woman who was about to become Royce Calloway's wife, in a wedding already scheduled and anticipated by half of Chicago's upper class, she was used to reading other people the way she read a contract. Finding the hidden clause, predicting the next move. As the hidden mastermind who had subtly orchestrated the financial trap around Eli Calloway, Tabitha was furious to learn from her inside sources that a mere janitor had managed to crack her perfect code. This wasn't just about a change in Royce's mood. It was a direct threat to her grand ambition. She realized this nameless woman was a dangerous wild card. Sitting before her vanity, her face instantly shedding all tenderness, she picked up her phone to call her operatives. She needed to know everything about Delaney Ward and find a way to destroy her credibility before the truth could surface. The uglier the better, she added, then ended the call. In the days that followed, pieces of information were brought back to Tabitha one by one, and she assembled them with the patience of a hunter. She learned that the woman was working as a cleaner inside Royce's very own tower, a detail that made her laugh softly because of its irony. Then she dug deeper, tracing backward to the time before Delaney became a nobody. And what she found made her eyes brighten. An audit report she had refused to sign, a dismissal arranged with careful precision, a name blackened across the industry, a professional license suspended pending investigation, and most importantly, an old debt the woman still hadn't fully repaid from her hardest days. To a lawyer like Tabitha, this wasn't a story of injustice. It was an arsenal. She understood that truths, when arranged correctly and told in the right tone, could turn an innocent person into someone suspicious in everyone's eyes. She didn't need to lie. She only needed to select the truth, emphasize this, leave that in the shadows, and let the crowd draw the exact conclusion she wanted them to draw. She placed all those papers into a leather briefcase, clicked the latch shut with a dry, crisp sound, and sat silently for a while by the window, looking down at the glittering city below. She didn't hate Delaney Ward. She didn't even bother to think of her as a person. To Tabitha, that woman was simply an obstacle in the wrong place, and obstacles could always be removed, cleanly, legally, and without leaving any trace leading back to her. She took a sip of wine, smiled to herself in the dark, and began planning the way she would strike, not with a noisy blow, but with a move so smooth that by the time Delaney Ward realized she was falling, there would be nothing left for her to hold on to. Tabitha's blow came on a Wednesday afternoon, and it arrived exactly the way she had calculated. Smooth, legal, and without leaving a single trace that led back to her. When Delaney had just returned to the boarding house after her shift, she saw two men in business clothes waiting outside her door, holding notices stamped with the seal of a state regulatory agency. They read the contents to her in the flat voices of people who were only following orders, saying that she was being investigated for practicing professional financial consulting, while her license was suspended, an act considered impersonating a certified professional, and that there had been specific statements about her advising people in the neighborhood on contract matters and financial legal issues. Worse still, attached to that accusation was a second, heavier one, that there was evidence showing she was still unlawfully keeping confidential data from her former company, the place she had left in disgrace, and that this could constitute theft of information. She had 48 hours to submit all documents proving her innocence. Otherwise, the case would be escalated to a higher level, and all her activities would be suspended, including her cleaning work. Delaney stood motionless in the hallway, the papers in her hand, and for the first time in a very long while, she felt the ground beneath her feet threatening to collapse. She understood immediately that this was no coincidence. Those statements, this timing, the smooth coordination of two accusations striking at once, all of it had been arranged by a hand that knew exactly who she was and knew precisely where to hit so it would hurt the most. And the attack didn't stop there. That very evening, the owner of the boarding house knocked on her door, his face full of apology but his voice firm. He said he was very sorry, that he knew she was a decent person, but that he had just received pressure from somewhere he couldn't conveniently name, that if he continued renting to someone under investigation, he would get into trouble himself, and that she needed to move out within the next few days. Delaney didn't argue. She didn't beg, because she had lived enough to know that this man was only another pawn being pushed forward, just as she was, and that the real person behind it was sitting somewhere far away, very high above, clean and safe. That night, after leaving Posey to sleep at Mrs. Marlowe's, as she often did on nights when she needed quiet to think, Delaney sat alone in the room that now seemed ready to cave in around her. She looked at the notices spread across the table, looked at the brief span of 48 hours already counting down, and helplessness rose until it lodged painfully in her chest. She knew the papers that could prove her innocence were all sitting in records back in her former city, knew that obtaining them properly and in time was almost impossible, and knew that the person behind all of this had calculated down to the hour in order to force her into exactly this trapped position. But what tightened her heart was not the risk of losing her job, nor even the risk of losing the roof over her head. It was Posey. It was the little face sleeping peacefully in the room upstairs, the child who had no idea that the small, warm world her mother had struggled so hard to build for her was trembling at its very foundation. Delaney thought of her daughter, and in that moment, fear almost drowned her. The private fear of a single mother, the fear that no matter how hard she tried, no matter how honest she remained, people would always have a way to take everything away. She lowered her head into her hands, and for the first time, after so many months of staying strong, her shoulders began to tremble softly. But even in that weakest moment, deep inside her, there was still something that refused to fall. A small voice reminded her that she had once risen from a place even lower than this, and that for the sleeping child upstairs, she had no right to let herself stay at the bottom for too long. Night drifted deeper, and Delaney was still sitting there in the dark room, not bothering to turn on another light, with only the weak glow from the street spilling through the window and drawing blurred streaks across the wall. She had stopped crying long ago, and what remained after the tears was not relief, but an exhausted emptiness. The emptiness of someone who had fought for too long and had begun to wonder whether she had chosen wrong from the very beginning. In that darkness, for the first time, she allowed herself to think of the forbidden thing she had always pushed away. If only 3 years ago she had signed that audit report, if only she had done what they told her to do, had closed her eyes and let it pass, had chosen what was easy instead of what was right. By now, perhaps she would have had a decent office, a salary enough to live on, and more important than anything else, her Posey wouldn't have had to grow up in a cramped boarding room, wouldn't have had to move from one place to another again and again, wouldn't have had a mother who came home every morning with calloused hands from scrubbing other people's floors. She had always believed that honesty was the only thing she could leave her child, an inheritance more precious than money. But tonight, sitting in the wreckage that very honesty had brought upon her, she was no longer sure. Did a 6-year-old child need a mother so upright that she had nothing left? Or did she need a mother who knew when to lower her head so her child could be warm and fed? That question tormented her, gnawed at her, and she couldn't find an answer. She stood, walked to the window, and her eyes accidentally stopped on a sheet of paper neatly taped there. It was a copy of the picture Posey had drawn. The little girl had excitedly drawn another one just like it for her mother after giving one to Mrs. Marlowe, and Delaney had taped it to her own window. Beneath the dim light from the street, she saw 3 figures holding hands in front of a tall building that reached up to pink clouds, oversized smiles drawn in red crayon, and in the middle was a tiny little girl whom Posey had labeled in her crooked child's handwriting as "Me and Mommy." Delaney stood still, looking at the picture for a long time. In the world Posey had drawn, there were no investigation notices, no people sitting high above and pulling strings, no fear and no injustice. Only a little girl holding her mother's hand and smiling, a little girl who believed with absolute innocence that her mother was the strongest person in the world and would always be able to protect her. And it was that innocent faith, drawn in those clumsy strokes of crayon, that touched something inside Delaney no argument could reach. She realized that if tonight she chose to bow her head, chose to run, chose to let those people win, then what she would lose was not her job or her home, but the very person the child in that drawing believed her to be. She couldn't teach her daughter to stand tall if she herself knelt down. Something inside her hardened again, slowly but certainly, like the spine of a person who had just remembered who she was. She lifted her hand, wiped her face dry, took a deep breath, and when she exhaled, the fear was still there, but it no longer controlled her. She wouldn't run. She had run from her former city once, and she wouldn't repeat it. This time, she would stay. She would fight, not with power or money she didn't have, but with the one weapon no one had managed to take from her hands, the truth. She walked back to the table, switched on the small lamp, pulled the old computer toward herself, and began. Royce learned about it the next morning through the quiet driver himself, the same man who had once told him about the cleaning woman who knew how to read lies. When he heard about the 2 accusations aimed at Delaney, about the 48-hour deadline, about the fact that she was about to be forced out of her home, Royce set his coffee cup down on the table, and his face hardened in the way everyone who worked for him knew was the sign of his coldest anger. He didn't need anyone to tell him whose hand was behind this. The timing, the precision, the way the 2 blows had been coordinated to drive one person into exactly the kind of corner with no way out. All of it bore the mark of one person he knew far too well, the woman who still sat across from him at dinner every evening with a gentle smile and eyes that never revealed a thing. Royce said nothing to Tabitha. He only picked up his phone and began making calls. One call went to the boarding house owner, brief and direct, enough for the frightened man to understand that the invisible pressure weighing on him a few days earlier had now been replaced by a much greater pressure from the opposite direction, and that his tenant would be left in peace for as long as she wanted to stay. Another call went to someone he knew inside the regulatory agency, not to shut down the investigation, because Royce understood that doing so would only make everything look more suspicious, but to make sure it would be carried out fairly, by proper procedure, without being manipulated by statements bought with money. In a single morning, the invisible net Tabitha had cast to tighten around Delaney's throat began loosening knot by knot, and the woman herself didn't even know it yet. That afternoon, Royce went to the boarding house himself. He knocked on Delaney's door, and when she opened it, still holding the stack of papers she had spent the entire night working through, she froze when she saw him standing there, the most powerful man in the city, standing in that shabby hallway beneath the flickering yellow light. He told her what he had done, briefly, without display, as if it were only obvious. "The landlord won't bother you anymore," he said, "and the investigation will be handled properly. No one will be able to invent anything else to harm you." Delaney listened in silence, and instead of the relief he had expected to see on her face, he saw something else, caution mixed with self-respect. "Thank you for the place to stay," she said slowly, "because that concerns my daughter, and I won't refuse anything that keeps a roof over her head." But then she lifted her eyes and looked straight into his, and her voice grew firm. "As for that investigation, I will face it myself. I don't need you to use your connections to save me. I only need it to be judged fairly, and the rest I'll prove with my own documents." Royce looked at her, a little surprised, because he was used to a world where people competed for his protection, where any hand he extended was always seized eagerly. He said he had enough power to make the entire matter disappear in a single day, that she didn't need to struggle like this. But Delaney shook her head. "If you make it disappear with power," she said, "then to everyone out there, I will always be a guilty woman protected by a powerful man. I don't want to be pardoned. I want to be cleared, and those 2 things aren't the same. I've already lost too much for holding on to my innocence. I won't let people think that in the end, I had to hide behind someone else before I could be clean." The narrow hallway sank into silence for a while, and in that silence, something shifted between them. Royce looked at the woman standing before him, the woman the whole world seemed to be joining together to knock down, yet who still refused the shortcut, who still insisted on rising with her own 2 feet, and he realized that the strange feeling growing inside him was not pity, nor even admiration for her talent, but a deep respect for a person who possessed something all his fortune couldn't buy, an unbreakable dignity. He nodded softly, accepting the boundary she had drawn, and said that if that was what she wanted, then he wouldn't save her. He would only stand beside her, and the rest would be hers to prove. When he turned to leave, for the first time, he understood that there were people who stood taller the lower they were forced down, and that this woman, not because she needed him, but precisely because she didn't need him, had become the only one capable of stirring his hardened heart. To clear herself of the accusation of stealing data, Delaney needed to prove the lawful origin of everything she had ever touched in her profession, and that forced her to trace back through the entire public record of the old company that had destroyed her, through the financial corporations connected to it, through the tangled network of names standing behind the city's investment world. For several nights in a row, after Posey had fallen asleep, she sat beside the old computer, following ownership trails, mergers from decades earlier, dusty corporate records that almost no one bothered to open anymore. And it was inside that maze of data that the very skill she had been punished for led her to something she hadn't been looking for at all. She came across the name Calloway, not Royce, but the name of his grandfather, tied to a financial crisis that had nearly drowned the entire family empire about 30 years earlier. She kept reading, and the instincts of a forensic accountant rose inside her when she realized the numbers from that period didn't tell the story people had always believed. The Calloway empire should have collapsed completely that year, dragging thousands of people out of work and leaving countless small investors with nothing, if not for one man who had discovered the fatal flaw in the books and quietly patched it, saving the whole corporation from the edge by the narrowest margin. And when Delaney traced that man's name, her fingers froze on the keyboard, and the entire room seemed to fall silent. That man's last name was Ward. He was her father. She sat motionless for a very long time before the screen, her heart pounding, then plunged into reading everything that remained, fitting together every broken piece of a truth someone had deliberately torn apart and buried. Her father, a man honest to the point of rigidity, had saved the Calloway family, and the reward he received was betrayal. When he discovered that the rescue had been carried out through methods he couldn't close his eyes to, he spoke up, and the very people he had just saved turned back and silenced him. They used power and money to smear his name, push him out of the industry, drive him into bankruptcy, turning a quiet hero into a forgotten failure. He died a few years later in silence and poverty, carrying to his grave a truth no one was willing to hear, and she, his daughter, had been far too young then to understand why her father had left this world with an unnamed bitterness in his eyes. Now, 30 years later, sitting in a shabby boarding room at the foot of the very tower her father had once saved, Delaney finally understood. She understood why her own last name had left such a strange echo inside her when Mrs. Marlowe mentioned it. She went to the old woman the very next morning, placed everything she had found on the table, and Mrs. Marlowe, after glancing over the pages, only closed her eyes softly and nodded. She said she had been waiting for this day for 30 years. She had worked in that tower when she was young, had seen everything with her own eyes, had watched the most decent man she had ever known be crushed by the very people he had saved, and she had kept that memory inside her because there was no one left to tell, because people had rewritten history to suit themselves. She looked at Delaney with wet eyes and said that from the first day she saw her step into the boarding house with that straight back and those eyes, she had suspected Delaney was his blood, but she hadn't dared to say it, because she wanted Delaney to find the truth herself in her own way. Delaney sat in silence, and inside her rose an emotion more complicated than pain. She realized that what her father had left her was not a fortune, not land or money, but a debt of honor that had never been repaid. A buried truth waiting to be spoken aloud, and she was the only person still alive who could speak it. Delaney arranged to meet Royce in his high-floor office after the city had lit up, and she came not as a cleaning woman, nor as someone he had asked for help, but with a stack of files held tightly against her chest, and the strange calm of a person who had finally understood who she was. She placed the pages on the desk between them, one sheet at a time, without rushing, and told him to read. Royce looked at her, then looked down at the pages, and as he began to read, his face slowly changed. He read about the crisis that had nearly drowned his family 30 years earlier, the disaster he had only vaguely known through the polished stories told by the adults in his house. But what was written on the paper was not the story he had been told. He read about a man who had discovered the deadly flaw in the books and quietly saved the entire corporation from collapse, a man whose last name was Ward, and he looked up sharply at her with a question in his eyes that had not yet become words. "My father," Delaney said, her voice soft, but every word clear as if carved into the air. "The man who saved everything your family has today was my father." Royce continued reading, and he reached the part she had read several nights before, the part where they had turned around and betrayed the very man who had just saved them. He read about how they smeared her father's name when he refused to stay silent about the methods he couldn't accept, how they pushed him out of the industry, drove him into bankruptcy, and turned an upright man into a name erased from the city's memory. The more he read, the tighter his hand clenched around the edge of the desk, and when he set down the final page, he couldn't say a word. The most powerful man in Chicago, the man who had never bowed his head to anyone, sat silently before the pages accusing his own bloodline of sin. "My grandfather," he finally said, his voice strangely hoarse. "I was always taught that my grandfather built everything from nothing, that this entire empire was his achievement." He stopped, and in that silence, something painful was breaking open. "No one ever told me it was built on another man's back, that it was preserved by destroying the man who saved it." Delaney said nothing to comfort him. She let the truth speak for itself. "My father died when I was too young to understand," she said, and for the first time during the meeting, her eyes glistened with tears. "I only remember that he always taught me numbers. Never know how to lie. Only people lie with them. Back then, I thought it was just a lesson about the work. Only now do I understand that it was the last words of a man who paid for his whole life simply because he refused to lie. He left this world as a failure in everyone's eyes, a name no one remembered, and for 30 years, no one knew that the forgotten man was the true reason your family still exists today." Her voice broke on the final sentence, and she had to stop to catch her breath. Royce stood, walked around the desk, and for the first time, he looked at her not as a gifted woman, or as someone worthy of respect, but as the daughter of a man to whom his family owed an immeasurable debt. He thought of that morning in the lobby, of the way he had spoken with contempt to the woman kneeling on the floor, the woman who, as it turned out, carried the blood of the greatest benefactor in his grandfather's life, and he understood that he had crossed the very line he had spent his whole life being proud of never crossing. "I'm sorry," he said, and those two words carried a weight no apology of his had ever carried before. "Not because of who you are, not because of who your father was, but because that morning I looked at a human being and didn't bother to see them. That is the very thing I have always despised in other people, and I did exactly that." Delaney dried her face, looked at him, and in her eyes there was no satisfaction of someone who had just overturned the game, only the exhaustion of a person who had carried this burden for her father all her life. "I didn't come here to demand that you repay a debt," she said softly. "I came so my father could finally be heard by someone from the Calloway family." And for the first time in that room of power, a man who had once made the whole city bow its head quietly bowed his own before the memory of a dead man, a man who had chosen the truth and paid for it with everything. The annual shareholders' meeting of the Calloway Corporation that year took place in the Grand Hall of the Tower, where hundreds of the most powerful people in the city's financial world had gathered, and Tabitha Voss chose exactly that stage to deliver her final blow. She appeared in a flawless outfit, her smile composed, and when it came time to speak, she stepped up to the podium with a stack of files in her hand, her voice sweet, as she announced to the entire room that there were certain things everyone ought to know about the woman to whom Chairman Royce Calloway had recently been giving special attention. She began releasing each piece one by one. An accountant dismissed in disgrace, a suspended license, a name blackened throughout the industry, a woman now under investigation for impersonating a professional and suspected of stealing data, and she arranged them so skillfully that the whole room would draw its own conclusion, that Delaney Ward was a fraud who had slipped her way into the life of the most powerful man in Chicago. Murmurs rose. Doubtful eyes turned toward the woman standing silently at the back of the hall, but Delaney didn't step back. She stepped forward. She asked to speak, and before anyone could stop her, she was already standing before the crowd with the very documents she had prepared through sleepless nights. "Mrs. Voss is half right," she said, her voice clear and calm enough that the whole hall fell silent to listen. "I was dismissed. My license was suspended. But she forgot to tell you why." Then she presented her own evidence, documents proving that the audit report she had refused to sign years earlier had concealed an act of embezzlement, that she had been punished not because she had done wrong, but because she had refused to do wrong, that the so-called data theft investigation rested only on staged statements that she now had enough paperwork to refute point by point. She presented everything with clarity and precision, each number placed exactly where it belonged, and the disguise of a fraud that Tabitha had tried to drape over her began cracking apart before everyone's eyes. In the middle of the shaken hall, a young voice rose from the front row. Eli, Royce's 16-year-old younger brother, stood beside his older brother, and with the steadiness of a boy protected by the adults around him, he said he was the one Delaney had saved. He told them that someone had built documents to pin on him a crime he didn't commit, that the best lawyers had all reached a dead end, and that the woman standing there was the only person who had found the truth and freed him from that trap. "If she's a fraud," he said, his voice trembling but certain, "then that fraud saved my whole life when no one else could." The entire hall went silent. Every eye now turned toward Tabitha, who was still standing at the podium with a smile that had stiffened on her lips. Then Royce stood. He walked forward and stood beside Delaney, facing all the shareholders and facing the woman who was about to become his wife. He said everything Delaney had just presented was true, that he had verified it himself, and that the attack against her had been arranged by the very people sitting in this hall. He didn't name Tabitha directly, but his eyes said everything. Among the shareholders was a major business alliance closely tied to the Voss family, an alliance everyone knew was a pillar of Royce's ambitions, and when he chose to stand with the truth, he understood exactly what he was giving up. By the end of the meeting, that alliance announced its withdrawal, taking with it contracts and relationships it had taken him many years to build. Royce accepted the loss without blinking. Tabitha stepped down from the podium, came close to him, and for the first time, her face revealed a true emotion. Not the suffering of a woman losing love, but the bitter astonishment of someone who had just lost a game she had believed was already hers. "You're really doing this for her?" she asked softly, almost unable to believe it. Royce looked at her and answered that no, he was doing it because it was right, and that her problem had never been losing, but the fact that she had never believed righteousness could matter more than profit. Tabitha looked at him for a moment, then looked at Delaney, and in her eyes was the silent admission of a proud person who had realized she had misjudged everything. She said nothing more. She turned and walked out of the hall with her back straight and her steps even, carrying her ruined ambition with her, and the door closed behind her, as if closing an entire chapter of life that Royce had chosen to leave behind. 3 months later, on the ground floor of Callaway Tower itself, the place where Delaney Ward had once knelt every early morning to scrub stains from the granite floor, a small office had now risen with a simple sign, saying this was a place for free financial counseling for people who couldn't afford to hire a lawyer. Royce had set aside that space for her, not as a gift to atone for his guilt, but as a return of what should have belonged to the Ward family long ago. People lined up from early morning, poor laborers, single mothers, elderly people who had once been pushed to the end of the road by murky contracts, and Delaney met with them one by one, reading for them the numbers they didn't understand, showing them the traps hidden in the fine print, giving back to them the very thing she had once almost lost, the belief that truth still had a place in this world. Her father was finally cleared, his name recorded again as the man he had truly been, an honest man who had saved an entire empire and been betrayed by it, and this time, no one could erase that name anymore. One weekend afternoon, as golden sunlight drifted softly through the tall glass windows, Posy ran happily around her mother's new office, a box of crayons in her hand, and Eli, the teenage boy who now smiled more often, sat down on the floor with her, patiently helping her draw a tall building that reached up to pink clouds. The two children laughed, and that laughter filled the space that had once been the cold stone lobby, making it warm in a way all the money in this tower had never been able to do. Royce stood leaning against the doorway, watching the scene, and when Delaney stepped to his side, he said quietly that he wasn't asking her to forgive him for that morning, because there were some things an apology couldn't erase. He was only asking her to give him a chance to begin again, this time as a man who knew how to see a human being before seeing their position. Delaney looked at him for a long time, then nodded softly. Not because he was powerful, not because of anything he could give her, but because she had seen a person truly change, and she believed everyone deserved a chance to become better. On the top floor of the old boarding house across the city, Mrs. Marlowe Hartley sat beside the window where Posy's drawing was taped, looking toward the tower glittering in the afternoon sun. She smiled, and in a very soft voice, she whispered to someone who now lived only in memory that he could rest easy, that the final debt had been paid, and that his daughter had done what the whole city had owed him for 30 years. This story reminds us of one simple thing that people sometimes forget, that a person's true worth doesn't lie in the clothes they wear or the job others can see, but in the integrity inside them that nothing can buy, and that respect must be given to everyone, even the person we think is the lowest, because we never know how extraordinary a soul may be behind such an ordinary appearance. If the story you just heard touched your heart, please press subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so we can spread kindness to even more people, and so each day you can have more meaningful stories to listen to. How do you feel about Delaney's story? And what do you think of her choice and Royce's choice? Please leave a comment below and share the feelings from deep inside your heart, because we're always eager to listen to every thought you have. Thank you for staying with us until the very last moment. May you and the people you love always have abundant health, live in peace, and find joy in each ordinary day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next stories.